I mean, my job is to be on recession watch. That's what I do. So I'm always on recession watch. Look, I think if you ask people who do business cycle stuff, they'll say any given year, if let's say I'm going to name a year, 2073. What are the odds the U.S. has a recession in the year 2073? If based on history, you should say something like 20%, 15%, pick a number. So if that normal number would be 15% or 20%, I think we are elevated right now. Look, I think but you can clearly say that we're elevated and the odds are more like 30, 40, 50% without saying it's a sure thing or that we're in one now or that there's no question we're heading into recession.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Brinkman. Economic forecasting has often been as much of an art as a science. But since the pandemic, it seems to have turned into a full-on Jackson Pollock painting. Remember when Biden-era inflation was transitory and no one need worry? Or when a recession was a 100% certainty at the start of 2022? Or how about when Trump's election to a second term marked the start of new boom times? You'd be forgiven if you started to think that folks were just flinging shit at the wall. But even in this era of uncertainty and folly, this moment feels especially disorienting. What's the deal with all the on-again, off-again tariffs? Are the latest promising inflation numbers the calm before the storm? And what do Republicans actually want to do about the deficit, or Medicaid, or taxes? Lucky for us, if anyone can make sense of this economic Jackson Pollock, it's our guest on today's podcast. Neil Irwin is the Chief Economic Correspondent at Axios, and he's also the author of The Alchemists and How to Win. Neil, welcome to the podcast.
Galen, thanks for having me.
So we have spoken before, and I had every intention of reaching out to talk to you today. But as something of a gimmick, I asked ChatGPT to give me a list of the best economic reporters in the United States. Do you want to take a guess at where you ranked?
I am hesitant to even guess because if I just make the list, I'm thrilled.
Neil, you were number one. Are you friends with Sam Altman?
Apparently, that payoff worked out pretty well. Sent that bribe and the training materials like my stuff, I guess.
Right. Okay. So I want to talk to you about two things that are on the top of people's minds today, which is one, the economy, but then also the major tax and spending bill that Republicans are working on in the House. But let's start with the former so we can build some groundwork before we talk about what Republicans want to do with the economy next. How would you describe the current state of the economy? And I have a lot more specific questions to get into, but I want to give you if I'm extending the metaphor here, a blank canvas to start on.
Sure. Look, if you were a doctor and you looked at the patients of the economy, at the major indicators, they all look pretty good. The pulse, the blood pressure, all that sort of thing. The normal big high level things you look at, the unemployment rate, the job growth rate, the things in the details of GDP, kind of industrial production, things like that. They've all held up just fine. First quarter GDP was negative, but that was because of that front running of inventories where companies were bringing in lots of imports ahead of tariffs. So if you just looked at the kind of headline numbers, we wouldn't be talking about economic worries at all. We'd be talking about, hey, another good quarter for the U.S. economy. The issue is around the peripherals. It's around the kind of more edge case things that you look at to understand where things might be going. And the survey data has really fallen off a cliff. Inflation expectations have spiked. You see different surveys about businesses, how much they might do in hiring, CapEx, things like that, have softened. Whether that translates into something real, we don't know yet, but it's not showing up in the kind of headline important data.
Yeah, I mean, I have read this article multiple times at this point in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, that goes something along the lines of, bad economic news is everywhere except for in the actual data. Do you agree with those assessments, or do you think there is enough edge data, or would you put enough stock in the consumer sentiment data to say, no, you can see some bad economic news in the data?
I would definitely not put excessive stock in consumer sentiment or any one of these surveys. I think we've seen over and over that their predictive power is not really that great. You ask people anytime over the last 4 years, how are you doing? What's your sentiment? What's your confidence level in the economy?
They're like, absolutely terrible. And they're like, do you plan to are you going to actually keep spending? And they're like, absolutely.
Exactly. In fact, it's funny. I went on the the C-SPAN call-in show where they viewers call in. I did that a couple of years ago, and had a guy call in who was very anti-Biden, very angry at Biden and the Democrats, and said inflation's so terrible, the economy's so terrible. I mean, I just bought a second home, and buying furniture for it cost a fortune. Like, well, hold on for a second. So the economy's so terrible, you lack any confidence in the economy, but you just bought a second home and a full house full of furniture. The point is, the same could be happening right now, right? People are worried about tariffs, they're worried about the trade war, they're worried about the stock market, but they keep going to the store and keep buying the things they need. And ultimately, that's what an economy is. It's a perpetual motion machine of my spending becomes your income becomes my spending. It becomes a circle. And as long as that virtuous circle doesn't get broken by everything going on in Washington that I'm sure we'll talk about, you can still have a continuing kind of rolling U.S. economy that trundles on despite some of these headwinds and things that we keep talking about.
Why has sentiment become so unmoored from the economic foundation?
So this is more in the realm of speculation than solid evidence. But I think we all, everybody has politics brain more than they used to 20 years ago. I think you see this in the ways that the sentiment numbers, as broken down by partisan affiliation, they swing on a dime, much bigger swings than we used to see in past election cycles, the last 3 or 4 election cycles, where in November 2020, Democrats became sharply more pessimistic about the economy, Republicans sharply more confident. The inverse happened in 24. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And the scale of those swings suggests that whenever people get a survey question, they are more likely than in the past to view it through the framework and through the prism of their own partisanship in a way that when things involve real dollars, if you're deciding if you're a CEO of a company, you run a company, you're deciding whether to open a new location, you're deciding whether to hire new employees. That's a dollars and cents decision of whether you think you can make money by doing that. Those decisions seem to be less affected by politics. But when it's just a survey, it's costless to say, I really don't like Joe Biden. I really don't like Kamala Harris. I like Trump. So Trump got elected. I think the economy is going to be great now.
I think that's important to keep in mind and a theme of so much of the data that we talk about in a political context. So let's continue with the foundational numbers or features of the economy. I want to talk about tariffs because I think the tariff news has become so disorienting that people have lost track of the plot. I think there's almost this feeling that Trump backtracked all the way on the tariffs, which is very much not the case.
Yeah, so I think the best way to think of it is to look at the headline numbers of the weighted average tariff on U.S. imports, which might sound wonky, but it's pretty straightforward. On average, something imported, what is the tariff rate going to be on that thing, regardless of what country it comes from or the exact item it might be. And before Trump was elected back in 2016, that was about 1.5%. So typical thing coming in from name a country, name a good, 1.5%. Over his 4 years, Trump got that up to about 3% with all the stuff. Remember all the coverage of the trade war back in 2018, 2019, that basically doubled that rate from 1.5% to 3%. Now, even after these reductions, we're looking at something in the 15, 18, 20% range. And that's still extremely high. So that's a multiple of where it was certainly 5 years ago, but that's a big number. Now, at one point, with the kind of original April 2nd numbers that Trump was talking about, that would have been more like 25, 28%. So it's not as extreme as what was being discussed on April 2nd, but this is still a major step change, a major restructuring of the entire framework of global commerce. And we're only at the very earliest stages of seeing how that impacts prices, activity, everything domestically.
How much of the health of the economy depends on what happens next with tariff negotiations? Like, okay, say this sticks, nothing changes, and we land on an average 18% tariff on goods coming into the country. What might that do to the GDP or inflation? So
I think most of the mainstream analysis and modeling of this points to that what you're describing being, a measurable, the kind of hit to inflation and GDP and jobs that you might feel, you'll see in the data. Maybe it adds, the Yale Budget Lab did some numbers. I think their number was 1.3 percentage points to the price level, which means 1.3% extra inflation over the course of this year. A hit to GDP of 0.6, 0.8. So, maybe it's the kind of thing that brings GDP from a steady growth path to a slump and a very slow growth path. But that's not a recession, most likely. That's a kind of weak year, soft patch for the economy, not a catastrophe, not a recession. But there's an asterisk on that, which is you're describing a world where we have a new tariff regime. It's the new law of the land. It's the new way things are going to work. And then everybody can go about adapting their supply chains, adapting their purchases accordingly. And so far in the first almost 4 months of the Trump administration, that has not been what we've had. And so I would distinguish the step change in tariffs with the culture and tone of complete unpredictability around tariffs. And, if you are a businessman facing a 10 or 20% tariff, you don't like it. It really cuts into your margins or is going to annoy your customers, but you can model it and figure out a way to deal with it. If it's maybe 10% this week and 20% next week and 30% next week and 145% the week after that, and then it'll go back down again, that makes it very hard to plan anything and very hard to really commit to any kind of long-term investments, long-term hiring, that sort of thing. So that's where you get into some of these more psychological things that are hard to model, hard to put into a computer or a spreadsheet and spit out an answer. But if we continue to get the kind of erratic tone of policy, that's where you get the risk of something worse than a soft patch and something more like a recession or even something kind of serious.
So when folks hear about these tariffs, they should not be thinking in terms of what we experienced in, say, 2022, where annualized inflation peaked at almost 10% in the summer, for example. We're looking at modest increases to inflation, likely if tariffs remain around where they are.
Yeah, the thing to remember about the U.S. economy, we are a big country. We are a geographically diverse country. We make a lot of stuff. Most of what we consume is not imported goods. Compared to smaller countries, if you're Switzerland, if you're, name a country that's smaller than the U.S., which is most of them, much more of what you consume comes from other countries. We grow most of our own food, make most of our own energy. So it is true that the U.S. can do these tariffs without it completely knocking the sales out of the economy completely in a way that would be hard to do for some smaller countries. Again, that said, you will feel it. Like you will see it for certain items. This is why people have focused on Walmart and kind of China imports. Okay, Chinese imports at 30%. Well, a lot of the toys you see on the shelves at Walmart, a lot of the furniture you see in all kinds of stores, a lot of the stuff that we've gotten accustomed to that's made kind of household goods affordable, a lot of those are still Chinese imports, and 30% is not the kind of thing that can be absorbed in the margins that exist in those industries.
Yeah, to your point, Walmart's CEO said to expect price increases as a result of the tariffs. Trump responded saying that Walmart and China should eat the tariffs. What does Trump mean when he says Walmart eat the tariffs?
So look, companies are always having to make choices of what their markups are and what they think they can get away with, what their customers will bear, what their suppliers can bear. But the reality is, I looked it up, Walmart's operating margin last quarter was 5%, meaning their operating income was 5% of their total gross revenue for U.S. stores, 5.1%, I think. If you think about that, that does not leave room for a 30% tariff, right? Like if Walmart, took a 8 to 30% tariff, they'd be losing 25 cents on every dollar worth of stuff they sold, and they're not going to be doing that. So, the reality is consumer goods, especially these kind of commodity consumer goods that aren't highly specialized, they do not have massive margins where you can eat it. Now, on some other kind so look, the baseline tariff that Trump's talking about is 10% on virtually every country on earth, it looks like. That, by contrast, you can imagine there's some more room to absorb it. So there's a Federal Reserve Governor, Chris Waller, who's used this kind of language. Okay, so imagine there's 10% on an imported good. You imagine the supplier eats 3% of that in terms of less profitability. The retailer or the importer eats 3% of that in terms of less profitability. They raise the price 3%, and the consumer pays 3% more. Okay, you've gotten almost 10% there. It's kind of gotten absorbed, and the consumer only saw a 3% price increase. So, look, that's not catastrophic. Most stuff you buy, if it went up 3%, you wouldn't even notice. So I think that there is this question of how much stuff is taxed at 10% versus 30% or more. But you can see how it gets divvied up. Okay,
in that world, again, this is an imaginary world where tariff policy is stable and everything gets taxed at 10%, China gets taxed a bit higher. Does that work to encourage domestic production? I mean, what's the tariff level at which producers would reshore their manufacturing plants or whatever?
So the margin, certainly. I mean, there's no question that, if you're sitting there right now as a multinational company deciding, do you set something up in the U.S., if it's primarily serving U.S. domestic demand, at the margins, it changes the incentives and makes you want to invest in the U.S. we get back to this question of how stable is this policy going to be? There are legal challenges to the authorities that Trump has used to implement these. Might those prevail? Do you think that the president himself will keep these in place? Do you think that after he's gone, the next president will keep these in place? So you still have to make some judgment calls on, what's really at risk here. And then there's the other issue of, remember, if you're in the U.S. now, your inputs are being taxed too, coming in the country. So if you're, these business models where you bring in parts from around the world, assemble them in the U.S., sell them to U.S. Consumer base. Well, you don't really escape those tariffs if you locate the assembly in the U.S. if some of the inputs are still coming from overseas. So, look, it's a really complicated equation. These companies hire all kinds of consultants and logistics experts to figure it out and build their models. And the problem is, it's hard enough to build these models when policy is static. When policy is changing rapidly, it gets even harder to make these decisions. What I worry about, is to what we were saying earlier, is that it creates kind of paralysis, and that there's a risk that even if on net over time tariffs should encourage some stuff to be reshored, we get a dynamic where companies are paralyzed by the uncertainty.
Well, you heard folks at the start of this whole tariff process, CEOs say things like, okay, well, during the first Trump term, we moved our manufacturing to Vietnam. But now there was whatever it was, like a 50% or more tariff on Vietnamese goods. And it's like, well, what do you want us to do? Because we reacted to your policy the first time around, but now you're saying build it in America. But if after the next presidential election, there's a Democratic president who undoes those tariffs, we're just getting a factory online when the tariff goes away. So that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, where it disincentivizes doing anything in line with the new policy.
Yeah, and realistically, if we're talking about kind of just commodity goods, textiles, cheap toys, cheap kind of household things that are not terribly complicated, not terribly sophisticated in terms of their technology behind them, it's still going to make sense to make those goods in Vietnam or other kind of lower wage countries than the U.S. I mean, realistically, what it would cost to make T-shirts in the U.S., prices would not be what American consumers are willing to pay, even after paying the tariffs on imported Vietnamese goods. But yeah, I think it is, look, how U.S. companies that import from countries other than China fare in this is still really not sure, not really clear.
Do you think that Trump has been bullied by the markets into long-term taking a softer approach on tariffs?
I don't know about long term. I'm reluctant to predict what President Trump does in the long term. I think in the near term and right now, he absolutely was. We learned that for all the big talk on April 2nd and Liberation Day and doing these, rapid escalation of tariffs, all it took was a few bumpy days in the stock market, a surge in bond yields to get him to reverse course. And look, it's if he had not, I think a recession was all but certain. I mean, the path we were on in early April was toward running toward a brick wall, and they pumped the brakes and have clearly created off ramps to, again, using the numbers we were talking about earlier, more in the range of you'll feel this, it will create a soft patch in the economy, but probably won't mean a recession or something more catastrophic.
Yeah, so we are dealing with a lot of unknowns here, but the latest consumer price index numbers show an inflation rate that is just about in line with Fed targets of 2%. I think the latest CPI data was 2.3%. Fed data is a little bit lower than that. So really just a positive picture in terms of where inflation stands today after 4 years of some pretty bad stuff. Is that the calm before the storm?
Yeah. Right now, we still have, the supply chain people talk about the bullwhip effect. It's, you crack the bullwhip and you make a small move with your wrist, and the end of the bullwhip moves, very rapidly and makes these huge moves. That happens with supply chains. We saw it with COVID in 2021, 22, where, if you shut down production and there's a shortage, there can be these long tail effects of the bullwhip going crazy. And we're at risk of that right now, because for the month of April, we had this 145% tariff in theory in place on China. So there were goods that normally would have been shipped from China to the U.S. Over the course of April and early May that just did not get shipped because it was not economical. So there is going to be kind of this air gap when the goods that are not arriving in the West Coast ports right now are not on store shelves in a month. Now, look, did retailers do a lot of inventory building before this in advance of tariffs? Will they be able to smooth it out? certainly to some degree. I'm not here projecting the kind of empty shelf shortages we saw in 20 and 21 with pandemic, but the idea that it will be visible in some way, whether that's through the price side or through the availability side and what's on the shelves, is more likely than not.
Sort of taking all of this under consideration, what do you think is the trajectory for interest rates over this year?
The conventional wisdom for months has been that the Federal Reserve will be in interest rate cutting mode, if not immediately, that they'll get there. That's looked a little more precarious as the years gone by, to Trump's dissatisfaction. I think the analysis that you're hearing out of the Fed right now is, look, they cut interest rates by a full percentage point in the last quarter of last year. Right now, as you said, inflation is kind of looking roughly where they want it to be. But there's these risks ahead that could tilt things on both the inflation side and the growth side and the unemployment side. So the Fed, they talked about the dual mandate. Their mandate is to have maximum employment and stable prices. So they feel like they're doing pretty okay on the stable price side right now, but they don't know how bad the inflation hit from these tariffs is going to be. And on the employment side, that's also looking pretty solid right now. So if both are looking pretty solid right now, that means you don't do anything. So they're kind of sitting on their hands waiting to see what comes next. The risk is that the trade war makes both sides of the mandate worse. It makes the inflation tick up again, and it makes the job market deteriorate further. And if that happens, they'll have to make some real judgments of which side is worse. And should they cut rates to try and deal with a worsening job market, or should they do nothing or raise rates because there's inflation in light of we've had this elevated inflation for 5 straight years now. So it's a less easy calculus than they've often faced. And I think they're content to just wait it out and see. They want the data to really point decisively one side or the other before they take an action, before they make a move. And that's where they are. So, we could easily get to the end of the year and they don't do anything. They just sit on their hands and wait it out until the data on one or both of those sides of the mandate move more decisively than it has so far.
We're talking on Monday, May 19th, after a month of a real boomerang in the stock market, where it looked like the stock market was in free fall after Liberation Day, and I think the S&P 500 was hitting records at the end of last week. And also, sort of this morning before we got online, it seemed like there was again softness in the market with concern over American debt and deficit levels and the like. People who are looking at the stock market right now, trying to make sense of that month of information, what would you tell them?
Look, we've seen there's a lot of buoyancy in the U.S. stock market. We've seen it for the last decade, but certainly for the last few years. Look, the market wants to go up. People want to buy U.S. stocks despite all the challenges and risks that we're talking about. And as soon as the president kind of showed what we talked about earlier, that he is a little afraid of the stock market and the bond market and is not going to let things just go off the rails, and that he was willing to de-escalate and try and save face and just move on, especially with China, like that. Those were all signs that, okay, maybe it is okay to be back in U.S. stocks. And so we've had this round trip in the stock market that's pretty extraordinary. I will say, bond yields have remained elevated, especially for longer term bond yields, which is a sign that there are some deficit worries that people who buy U.S. Treasury bonds are a little worried that our deficits are so large that rates are just going to have to be higher than they have been in order for the U.S. government to fund itself.
To your point about concern over the country's debt and deficit, Moody's was the last of the major credit ratings agencies to give the U.S. a AAA credit rating, and last Friday, it downgraded the country's credit rating. Obviously, other ratings agencies had already downgraded the United States. How meaningful is that? Was that more like a symbolic move because of what folks see being negotiated in Washington right now? Was it a specific reaction to tariffs? What does that mean?
So in isolation, these credit rating agencies, if you're thinking about buying bonds from a municipal sewer authority in some mid-sized town, the credit rating agencies do you a great service because they research the finances and make sure that's a credit-worthy borrower and assign it a rating. And so when you buy a triple B bond out of that sewer authority, you know what you're getting, and that's a useful service. The U.S. Treasury bond market is not like that. It's probably the most scrutinized market in the world. You have a lot of the smartest, strategists and hedge fund managers and sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors of all stripes, kicking the tires, thinking about what's going to happen with debt issuance, with interest rates, with inflation, with everything under the sun, in a very sophisticated way. So it's not like there's anything going on in U.S. politics that Moody's knows about that entire constellation of sophisticated investors don't know about, that isn't already priced in. That said, look, I think when these credit rating agencies say, I think things are so dysfunctional in the U.S., there's so little focus on a path toward deficit reduction that we're going to do a downgrade, it does have a way of kind of crystallizing attention on the issue and, it gets people's attention. We saw this, the most famous one was summer of 2011 when Obama was president. Mm-hmm. There was a debt ceiling standoff, and I believe it was S&P cut their rating, which came as just a bolt out of the blue. It was shocking to people that the U.S. credit rating would be in doubt. Again, not a lot of substance behind that assessment beyond stuff that was kind of widely understood, but the fact that they did it got people's attention. I think the same is true this time.
So in some ways, almost a little political. And to that end, I do want to move on to politics. But my last question in our Econ 101 section is a little bit of a trap, given how I set this whole show up, which is, after everything that we've discussed, should folks be on recession watch?
My job is to be on recession watch. That's what I do. So I'm always on recession watch. Look, I think if you ask people who do business cycle stuff, they'll say any given year, let's say I'm going to name a year, 2073. What are the odds the U.S. has a recession in the year 2073? If based on history, you should say something like 20%, 15%, pick a number. So if that normal number would be 15% or 20%, I think we are elevated right now. Look, I think but you can clearly say that we're elevated and the odds are more like 30, 40, 50% without saying it's a sure thing or that we're in one now or that there's no question we're heading into recession. And I would put a little asterisk on that, which is that, whether something is ultimately technically judged a recession is not the most important thing, because you can have periods where the economy feels bad that isn't a recession. You can have periods that aren't that bad where it is. 2001, the economy went into recession in March. If 9/11 hadn't have happened, it was a very mild, weird recession. There wasn't even 2 quarters of negative growth, which is sometimes a rule of thumb. And if 9/11 hadn't happened, it probably wouldn't have been classified a recession at all. So it doesn't matter that was a recession. Well, I don't know. 01, 02, those were pretty rough years for the job market. The technical designation is not what matters. What matters is, can people get a job? Is inflation contained? Are people's incomes stable? And within that, there's a lot of room for some softness and weakness that doesn't necessarily have to tip the balance into a formal recession.
Right, because technically a recession is 2 successive quarters of declining GDP. And we've already experienced one. And so if we experienced one more, we would technically be in a recession.
Well, it's a little complicated. So the 2-quarter thing is a nice rule of thumb that's used around the world. In the U.S., we tend to favor the National Bureau of Economic Research Business Cycle Dating Committee that has its whole definition of a sustained. I can't even do it off the top of my head, but they have a definition on their website that you can look at that does tend to align with GDP moves, but it's a little more nuanced.
But all that is to say that even if we were to see another decline in GDP growth in the next quarter, if the other data that we're looking at, like inflation, unemployment, et cetera, remains where it is, you wouldn't be so concerned with that technical recession.
Right. Yeah. GDP especially, there's so many things that can affect quarter-to-quarter GDP that are not, I don't want to say not real, but are not really giving you a true read on the state of the economy. Right. So in the first quarter, it was a negative quarter for GDP because importers were bringing over a bunch of goods in advance of possible tariffs. But that didn't make people's living conditions and economic conditions they feel worse off. That was just a technical function of an anticipated policy change in how the arithmetic works of GDP. Same with inventory buildups. Look, the trend line has remained pretty solid. I would be shocked if there ends up being a recession this year. I would be shocked if it turned out to already be underway, just because we have not seen it in the things you normally, initial jobless claims. We get that number every week. It has not elevated. Companies have not started doing layoffs because of this, as far as we can tell. So not that we can't have a recession, but I'd be surprised if it's already started if we do turn out to have one.
All right, let's move on and talk about the tax and spending legislation being considered by Republicans in the House. But first, a break. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener, in particular, paid subscribers at gdpolitics.com. Here's what some listeners had to say about why they chose to subscribe. Excuse me while I toot my own horn here. Matt says, I'm finally pulling the trigger, really loving the podcast. It makes me feel less depressed about politics. Matt, I'm glad to hear that. Kristen says, I want you to succeed! Exclamation point. Aw, Kristen, I want you to succeed too. Mary says, I supported because my relationship with the 538 podcast, specifically with you at the helm, was more consistent over the last 9 years than my relationship with my now husband. Till death, Galen. Wow, Mary, I'm flattered. Glad to hear we have such a solid relationship. Darren says, I'm a longtime fan and some of your recent conversations made me push that button. Niels says, I supported your work because I really enjoy the podcast despite the bloody awful theme music. Niels, I'm sorry about that theme music. Basically, every aspect of this podcast came together in a 7-day period during which I lost my job. But I'll work on getting you some better music. Will says, Hi, Galen. Have loved your work for years and good luck on the solo front. I'm an independent podcaster myself on French Revolutionary history, so I appreciate all the work required to keep a show on the air. Looking forward to the midterms and beyond. Well, I'm also looking forward to the midterms. And finally, Andrew says, breakout podcast of 2025, mark it down. Andrew, thank you. Join these paid subscribers over at gdpolitics.com. That's gdpolitics.com. Do it right now. Before we get back to talking about the economy, that's gdpolitics.com, and thank you. The 1,100-page package has been officially named the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, per President Trump's suggestion that Republicans combine all of their legislative priorities into a single bill. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said he hopes to pass the bill by Memorial Day weekend, this coming weekend. So far, it's been winding its way through the House committees, where divides within the Republican caucus have become apparent. Some of the biggest aims of the legislation are to, 1, make the 2017 Republican tax cuts permanent, 2, make further business-friendly tax changes, 3, end taxes on tips and overtime pay, as Trump promised on the campaign trail, 4, make spending cuts to help pay for those tax cuts focused on programs like Medicaid and nutritional programs, 5, increase spending on defense and immigration enforcement. And then there are some other pieces of legislation that take some starring roles but have maybe less of an impact on the overall numbers, things like state and local tax deductions. Neil, am I forgetting anything important here in laying out the contours of this bill?
I mean, you're absolutely right on the contours, but there's a reason they call it the Big Beautiful Bill. It's big, and there's plenty of stuff that even a podcast 10 times as long as this one we would not be able to cover. But yeah, that's the upshot.
Okay, from the perspective of the deficit and the GDP, what effect would, and of course, it's being negotiated, it's liable to change. Republicans in the House right now are saying that even though they've passed it out of committee, they will not vote yes on the floor until other changes are made to the bill. Taking all of that, what effect would this big, beautiful bill have on the debt and the GDP as it stands?
On the GDP side, if you take at face value the kind of conservative philosophical view that encouraging business investment through the tax code is the most important thing to drive future prosperity, future GDP, future incomes, and that a well-designed tax code is a really important driver. So the group that does that kind of analysis, Tax Foundation, kind of right-leaning, pro-business, but they did really serious analysis. I believe their numbers were about a 0.7% bump to GDP out of this, which is not nothing in a $30 trillion economy. So that's meaningful. If you believe that business investment incentives really matter, that's the type of scale you're talking about. On the debt side, the numbers are huge. Different groups have their own numbers, but most of what I've seen is in the low $3 trillion range in terms of increased deficit over the next 10 years. That's if they do not extend some of the tax cuts that are set to expire in like 28 or 29. more like $4.5–5 trillion if they continue those tax cuts after 28, 29. So this really is something that would imply higher deficits for a long time to come and higher public debt.
Where do groups like the Tax Foundation or other groups who weigh in on these kinds of things, where do they come down? Like, is it worth the GDP growth if it means that much of an increase in the deficit?
I mean, this is where you get to kind of values issues that, tell me your philosophy of how the economy works and how the government ought to interact with the rest of the economy, and I can give you your answer. Look, I think that the reality is Democrats, you're going to hear a ton from Democrats in the next weeks and months as this proceeds about the trade-off here, which is it extends tax benefits that are disproportionately go to the affluent, go to the wealthy. It includes new tax cuts for business, and it includes some tax kind of giveaways and benefits for certain American workers. The tips thing is a good example, overtime wages. And it cuts a lot out of Medicaid and food stamps, and that's a trade that, and it enlarges the deficit a great deal, which could result in higher risk of a fiscal crisis down the road, higher interest rates for everyone. So, look, that's the mix of policies, and that's what the president campaigned on, and that's what they want to do.
Well, if I remember correctly, the increase to the GDP, 0.7 is what you said, is pretty much in line with the decrease to the GDP forecasted by those tariffs, right?
It is. Right in the same ballpark, yes.
So does that mean that are the tariffs going to offset any of this deficit spending? Like, isn't the government going to collect a bunch more? Isn't it a roundabout way of increasing the corporate tax rate?
Yeah, so if you were to think of the trade war, the tariff stuff in concert with the legislation. So remember that the tariffs are being done through emergency authorities that are unilateral to the president, not through legislation. So the tariffs are not in this legislation. But if you thought of them collectively as one set of policies, yes, the tariffs would reduce some of the GDP boost you're getting, most of the GDP boost you're potentially getting out of tax reform. But they would also raise more revenue, which means not increasing the deficit quite as much. But that gets back to this question of, are the tariffs permanent or are they a temporary negotiating tool? And that's where you get into some really, again, how do you even model it if you're not even sure what the law is going to be a year from now?
You wrote a really good piece on the machinations within the Republican Party, describing the tension over this bill as a four-way tug of war. I'm curious if you could sort of outline the sticking points amongst the different interest groups within the Republican Party and sort of what the hurdles are that Republicans will have to get over if they are going to ultimately pass this bill.
One side in this kind of four-way tug of war is the more traditional business conservatives, the business lobbying groups in D.C., the more Reaganite kind of Republicans that are still around, and those are the ones who emphasize supply-side tax reform and things like business, the deductibility of R&D spending, the deductibility of accelerated depreciation of capital goods spending. So you can build a factory, you deduct it all in year one. You don't have to wait and depreciate it over many years. They believe that this is the kind of thing, a lower corporate income tax rate, that these are the things that unleash more rapid growth, more prosperity. That's core of their philosophy. But those are in tension with the more populist stuff that Trump talked about on the campaign trail. I haven't heard any Republicans argue that not taxing tip income or not taxing overtime income is somehow a supply side reform or something that will unleash the productive capacity of the U.S. economy. Rather, it's something that sounded good on the campaign trail, that helped get Trump elected, and that he and the people who are kind of more in his kind of MAGA world believe they got to do. They promised it. It's what we're doing. And so, but every dollar that goes to that stuff is not available for the more pro-growth stuff that the supply siders want to see. Then there's the deficit as a constraint, right? So as we've seen with the bond market in the last few weeks, we are at a place in the U.S. where if you blow out the debt more than we already scheduled to, the risk of interest rates really spiking, trouble rolling over those debts, challenges, even just paying the debt service, the interest costs year by year, really go up at the type of debt profile we have now. So the bond market and the debt markets are kind of a constraint and tugging in another direction. And then there's the more kind of the budget cutters, the House Republicans, the congressional Republicans, who really want to cut spending to the bone, primarily on Medicaid, food stamps, and other things that are part of the social welfare state. And, the thing is, a lot of their constituents rely on those things. And so there's a lot of Republicans who are saying, I don't know, guys, are we really going to cut Medicaid that a lot of our voters are relying on to get health care? And so you've already seen some fractures on how aggressive to go on Medicaid cuts within the House and Senate Republican caucuses.
When you think about how this could all be resolved, maybe the most obvious way is that Trump takes a clear stand one way or another and pressures individual lawmakers to get in line with his wishes. Is it clear where Trump comes down on all of this?
It's funny. You hear different things, and that he says different things to different people, and it's hard to have a common through line. This is, on the one hand, so for example, we had some reporting that's been confirmed by others subsequently that he was floating, what would create a little more revenue to work with on the populist stuff would be if we let the income tax on the very top earners over $600,000 go back to its pre-2017 rate. It's currently 37%, let it go to 39.6%, or maybe create a new millionaires bracket, and income over $2 million or something like that could go to 40% or 39.6%. You do that.
Is Trump finally becoming the populist that he promised everyone he would be, raising taxes?
He clearly was kind of floating this. People in his orbit were floating it, and the politics. The political theory is you create some revenue. It doesn't affect that many people. It only affects very rich people, and it dampens the Democrats' attacks. Oh, you're cutting Medicaid to give money to the rich. That's the political theory. But, you got immense blowback from the more traditional kind of Larry Kudlow, Grover Norquist of the world, the kind of anti-tax advocates who are, again, so deep in the DNA of Republican politics that the idea of raising taxes was just anathema to them. And it has not been talked about lately, but it clearly is an idea that has swum around and been tossed around within the Republican negotiators. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's just a sign of how fluid this is, that any idea can kind of come out of nowhere. And, this has come together very quickly and with a very small number of negotiators piecing it together. This is not something like we've seen with past major tax reform, where it's months and months and dozens of members of Congress participating.
All right. Well, we will see where Trump comes down and ultimately whether this makes it out of the House by Memorial Day weekend. I have one final question for you before you go, which is a more sort of philosophical question about all of the stuff that you cover and was important to 538 and important to everyone who works sort of in the data world, which is that you've heard some concern from folks in these coverage areas about the reliability of data under the Trump administration, and concern that if things were to turn south for the economy, that the White House would put pressure on government statisticians to either change politically inconvenient data or not publish it altogether. In particular, perhaps if the Schedule F plan goes into place, then these statisticians could be fired and whatnot. And, this is like a concern that folks talk about when they look at countries like, Turkey or China or whatever. Is this a real concern? Are you worried about the reliability of economic data over the next 3.5 years?
I am, with a couple of caveats. Look, the truth is, if what we're talking about is just, all right, the Bureau of Labor Statistics does the jobs report on the first Friday of every month, and they put out a press release with summarizing the data and then 35 pages of tables. If all that changes is that press release on the front page that's on the first page of the document that's currently a very dry summary of what's going on, includes some bombast and some emphasis and focus on the best numbers in this report, we those of us who do this for a living, we know how to look past that, go to the tables, look at the numbers that really matter and see what's going on. That wouldn't be great for the kind of image of nonpartisanship, but we can live with that. I think what's more worrying is one of two things. One is actively trying to manipulate the data itself to say to be untrue, to flatter partisan preferences. That would be very hard to do. Like BLS is very transparent. Like the microdata comes out a couple of weeks later, where you would somehow have to fake the what's the sample size of the Establishment Survey now? 70,000. I think the household is 70,000 a month or 60,000 a month. It's a huge data set collected by all these survey takers around the country. to try and manipulate that and fake that, I'm not sure how that would work exactly. I'm obviously it would be very bad if that started to happen. I'm skeptical it could, but you never know. I'm more worried than either of those things about just defunding these agencies. And economic data is the classic example of a public good, which is very expensive to create, but it's non-rivalrous, meaning I can use the data, you can use the data, General Electric can use the data, anybody can use the data for things they need to do to analyze what's going on in the economy. And it's free to us because we pay for it with taxes, but it would be highly inefficient for every company in the world that needs to do some, economic projections to try and create its own data set. So, we benefit, and policymakers rely on this stuff. If you're the Federal Reserve and you're trying to decide how to steer the car and it's foggy, you have your instruments and you have the data are the instruments. And if you can't trust those instruments anymore, it becomes a lot harder to drive a car. It's already hard to drive. So I think the risks of, if we're already having response rates are way down. People don't answer surveys anymore. This is figuring out how to use more electronic tools to get more survey participation is a real open question. So look, we want this data to get better, not worse. It's already, having challenges. And I think if you see further budget cuts or staffing cuts to these agencies that do this work, I think it would be, worsening a public good that we all benefit from.
All right. Well, we're going to leave things there for today. I really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Galen. A lot of fun.
My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us, maybe even tell a friend about the podcast. Also, importantly, subscribe to the Substack at gdpolitics.com. There you'll get updates on what we're doing, extras, and you can support this project directly. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.